In this video, I will talk about how to play Nebulirium Shipyard. After you set up the game, you will start by taking a day shift card. In this example, the day shift card says to gather resources rather than draft from the pool of dice. Player 1 decides to select 3 red and 3 yellow resources. Player 1 decides to build this ship for 3 yellow resources. He looks at the complexity level and ensures that he adds new ships equal to or greater than that complexity level and places it in the corresponding slot in the shipyard based on the timer deadline setting. Then, having taken resources and taken an action, player 1 passes the player board to player 2. Player 2 pulls a day shift card and takes its ability, which in this case is to take 3 adaptive parts. Player 2 then selects dice, in this case, a value of 4 blue resources. And there are no other dice that she can select that equals or is less than 6. So she decides to take the additional resources as red resources. So she gets 4 blue and the remainder in 2 red. This equals exactly 6 resources. Player 2 then decides to build this blueprint, which requires 2 blue and 2 red resources. She pays those resources back to the supply, notes the complexity level of the card to replace, and cards are replaced and placed in the appropriate time slot of the shipyard. Player 2 has finished her turn and passes the player board back to player 1. Player 1 draws a day shift card. In this case, the day shift card is hire a lawyer. So player 1 can scrap any card, and whoever has the most resources matching that card will take a lawsuit token. The player 2 has the most resources matching the card that was scrapped and takes the lawsuit token. The scrapped blueprint card is put into the discard, as well as the day shift card. Player 1 then selects dice. So he selects the 4 green. There's not a die that he can select that would be 6 or less. He wants to build this specific blueprint card. So he takes his 4 green, plus he takes the remainder in white. He then pays the 2 white, 2 green, and he doesn't have yellow, so he pays 2 adaptive parts for the yellow resource. Then he replaces the blueprint and places it in the appropriate slot. And places the completed blueprint in his completed pile. He then passes the turn to player 2, who draws a day shift card. This day shift card allows player 2 to exchange any number of resources. Player 2 decides to select red and yellow. Player 2 exchanges resources based on the day shift card. And she selected resources that would allow her to build this specific blueprint card. So she pays her resources to the supply, and the card is replaced based on the complexity level and placed into the appropriate shipyard slot. In this case, it required 2 cards to meet or exceed the complexity level. Player 2 discards the day shift card and passes the turn to player 1. Player 1 draws a day shift card. In this case, the card is Supervisor, who can go back and play any discarded day shift card. Player 1 decides to take 3 adaptive parts. Player 1 then decides to take resources. There's only 1 die left, so he takes 6 resources. Because the tray is empty, he also gets 1 adaptive part because he did not have a choice in which dice he selected. Player 1 sees that he has 2 cards from the same faction, and there's a flagship blueprint, which benefits from having the same faction. So he pays 7 red to acquire the flagship, replaces the ship blueprint card based on the complexity level. And then because this is a flagship, it stays face up. Player 1 is taking his turn and passes the player board back to player 2. We notice that the day shift cards need to be shuffled, so we reveal and activate a night shift card. This night shift card says to scrap the highest value point blueprint card. In this case, there are 2 of them, so both of them are scrapped. Then the day shift cards are shuffled. Placed in the day shift draw deck area to reset the draw deck. At this point, player 2 draws the next day shift card. In this case, it's take 3 adaptive parts. The dice tray is empty, and so the first thing that happens is we rotate the shipyard clockwise 1 notch, and then we check to see if there are any ships in the scrap area. At this time, there are not. So player 2 will re-roll the dice. Now that the dice are rolled, they're placed in the corresponding slots on the dice tray. And then player 2 resumes her turn by selecting dice from the dice tray. Player 2 decides to take the white and the blue. Player 2 decides to train for her action. That completes her turn, so she passes the dice tray back to player 1. Player 1 decides to take red. There's still a die that would equal 6 or less, which is green, so he takes 5 red and 1 green. He then pays 3 white and 3 red to complete this blueprint card. He makes note of the complexity level and replaces blueprints equal to or greater than that number and places it in the corresponding slot in the shipyard. Player 1 forgot to draw a day shift card, so he draws one. In this case, it allows him to trade out any resources for any other resources. He decides to trade in green for yellow. Player 1 has finished his turn, so he passes the trade to player 2. Player 2 remembers to draw her day shift card. Day shift card allows player 2 to take any resources of her choice without taking dice from the dice tray. Player 2 pays the resources for this specific blueprint card. It's replaced with the card going into its appropriate slot. The resources are placed back into the supply. And that finishes player 2's turn. She passes the dice tray to player 1. Player 1 has no choice in the dice he selects, so he takes the yellow 2. He takes the remainder in red. And because he didn't have a choice, he also grabs an adaptive part because the tray is empty. He then pays the resources to complete the specific blueprint card. And he replaces the card based on the complexity level. In this case, it requires more than one card to equal or exceed that complexity level. He places the card into his completed blueprint pile. Player 1 has now completed his turn, so he passes the player board to player 2. The player board is empty. The first player 2 draws a day shift card. This card is a lawsuit. So player 2 decides to scrap that specific blueprint, causing player 1 to take a lawsuit because he has the most matching resources, which in this case was red. The card also allows player 2 to discard up to 2 of her lawsuits, so she now has no lawsuits. The tray is empty, so the shipyard is rotated clockwise 1 space, and the dice are rolled. Had there been any ships in the scrap area of the shipyard, then there would have been another assignment of lawsuits. Player 2 selects her dice, converts them into the appropriate resources. Player 2 then selects a blueprint card and pays the appropriate resources. In this case, it's a flagship, so it stays face up. The flagship is replaced based on complexity level. Player 2 has finished her turn and passes the player board to player 1. Player 1 takes a day shift card. The day shift card is to select any previously played day shift card, so he selects the 3 adaptive parts. Player 1 takes resources based on the dice drawn. Player 1 then selects a blueprint to complete, pays the resource to the supply. He then replaces the card based on the complexity level and places it into the appropriate slot. And then places the blueprint in his completed pile. Player 1 has now completed his turn and passes the player board to player 2. Player 2 cannot take a day shift card because they're all out. The next night shift card is activated, which is a no effect, and the day shift cards are reshuffled and a new deck is created. Player 2 draws a day shift card. The day shift card allows player 2 to grab any number of resources rather than the dice. Player 2 has selected a blueprint card to complete, places the required resources into the supply, and the blueprint card is replaced. Player 2 turn is done. She passes the player board to player 1. Player 1 draws a day shift card. In this case, it's the hire a lawyer. So player 1 decides to scrap a card. He is immune to lawsuits. So the card he scraps matches a resource that the other player has a lot of. So she gets a lawsuit. He can also pitch up to 2 lawsuits. He then selects a dice from the dice tray. It's the last die that doesn't equal 6. So he grabs 4 red. And he also selects 2 blue. Player 1 checks to see how many matching resources he has in different colors and decides to train in yellow because he has more yellow symbols on his cards. The tray was empty when he selected resources, so he also should have received an adaptive part. Player 1 discards the day shift card, has finished his turn, and passes the player board to player 2. Player 2 draws a day shift card, which is to grab 3 adaptive parts. He then notices that the dice tray is empty, so the shipyard is rotated 1 notch clockwise. We check to see if there's any cards in the scrap. There are not. So player 2 re-rolls the dice. He places the dice into the corresponding slot on the dice tray. Player 2 drafts her dice. The total of her dice are 3. There's no die that she can pick that will equal 6 or less. So she takes the remainder in white, along with the 2 red and 1 yellow, based on the dice values. She then selects a blueprint card, pays those resources to the supply, and we replace the card based on the complexity level. She places the card into her completed blueprint pile. Player 2 has completed her turn and passes the player board to player 1. Player 1 draws his day shift card. It's a supervisor card. He decides to copy the take 3 adaptive parts. He discards the day shift card, and he selects dice. He uses those 6 blue new resources plus 1 additional blue to build a flagship that costs 7 blue. The flagship is then replaced. Player 1's turn is over. He passes the player board to player 2. Player 2 draws a day shift card. Player 2 selects resources. In this case, he selects green. Player 2 can exchange any number of resources based on the day shift card that she drew. She then selects a blueprint card to complete, puts the resources back to the supply equal to that ship's requirements. Because this is a drone, it also remains space up because it gives discounts later on. Player 2 passes the player board to player 1. Player 1 attempts to draw a day shift card but is empty, so he reveals a night shift card. This night shift card is that each player selects 2 types of resources and gets 3 of each of those resources. Player 2 decides to take 3 white and 3 red. Player 1 decides to take 3 white and 3 blue. Because the last night shift was drawn, we now begin the payday, which is the end of game scoring. So the instructions are in this section here. Because player 1 was the first to play and the payday hit, that ends the round. If player 1 had taken a turn and the payday showed up on player 2's turn, she would have completed her turn. The end game is that each player can either train or they can complete a blueprint card. Blueprints are still replaced in the final phase of the game. So player 1 has taken his extra endgame turn. Players do not gain additional resources during this stage of the game. Player 2 takes her last turn by selecting a blueprint card that she wants to complete. She pays the resources into the supply and places the completed blueprint into her pile. Cards are still replaced. Once all players have completed their extra action, the scorecard is pulled out and the players start to count their score. The first score category is flagships. So each player with a flagship looks at all of the cards that they completed to see how many matching factions that they have. In this case, player 2 has one flagship and one additional card. So he looks at the scoring card, reference card, to determine how many points he gets. In this case, he gets 3 points for having 2 matching ships. For his second flagship, he has a total of 5 matching faction symbols. So he gets 21 points. So 21 plus 3 is 24 total flagship points. Player 2 has 5 matching symbols for her flagship, so she scores 21 points. The next thing that is looked at is training points. So each player looks at each card that they completed and counts up each color based on how many tokens they have in their training module. In this case, player 1 has 4 yellow icons and 1 yellow token in his training module. So he scores 8 points, 2 points per symbol. Red, player 2, has 1 red training and 5 completed ships with red symbols on it. So player 2 scores 10 training points. Then each player counts up the total number of bits on all of their non-flagship cards and totals those. Once all of those totals have been calculated, you add up the flagship score, training score, plus card scores for the total score per player. Whoever scored the highest wins the game. Thank you for checking out Nebulirium Shipyard and how to play.